Thanks so much for stopping by and checking out the channel. I hope that you get some value out of this next video, and if you want to help the channel, please consider subscribing if you haven't, like and share the video for the edification of others. Thanks so much for being here, and enjoy.
I'm not here with a scientific agenda or a scientific idea to promote. I'm not even here as a philosopher or theologian, and those issues come into this conversation as well. I am a text analyst. It's what I do. I read text, I work through text, and my expertise in Hebrew on the one hand, the language, and on the ancient Near Eastern world, the culture, are the tools that I use to try to understand text better. I believe that the Bible has authority. And what the human author meant to say, what he intended to say, is what God's message is. Authority is vested in the author. It's God's authority, but it's vested in the author, and we have to go to the author to get it. The Bible is written for us, but it's not written to us. It's not in our language. It's not against the backdrop of our culture. We can't expect the author to come to us. The author doesn't know us. He doesn't know our world, our culture, our issues, our questions. The author doesn't know us. He's addressing his audience in his language, in his time, in his culture, with his issues. Problem. The Israelites aren't thinking chemistry. They don't know chemistry. Their periodic table is very small. They're not thinking in those terms. If we start to read chemistry, we're imposing on the text. We're dragging it into our cultural river. Immortal people don't need a tree of life. A waste of a totally good tree. By the way, their significance is often more so to us than in the Old Testament. After chapter 5, Adam and Eve are never mentioned again in the Old Testament.
When God communicates to Israelites, whose cosmic geography does he use? Do we expect God to use our cosmic geography? If so, would he count Pluto as a planet or not? You know? He communicates in terms that are familiar. Not to put a stamp of authority on this cosmic geography, but because you've got to use something to talk about. We are not free to give new meanings to words to accommodate our kind of thinking. We can't say, well, the Bible says that God stretched out the heavens. Big Bang cosmology. They didn't know. No, it doesn't mean Big Bang cosmology. They don't know the moon is an object. Same with sun and stars. They don't know they're objects. Well, what do they think they are? Exactly what they call them. Lights. Even though we know they're objects, and we can say God made those objects. By the way, yes, he did, of course. God built the house. Yes, of course, he did. The fourth commandment, in 6 days you shall do, that's asa, all of your work. On the seventh day you shall not do, that's asa, any of your work. For in 6 days the Lord your God, asa, the heavens and the earth. Okay, well, now what's going on? We translated do here and we translated do there. Why don't we translate do here? Well, of course, I'll tell you why. Because in English, it doesn't make any sense to say God did the heavens and the earth. We're driven by Hebrew idiom. I'm not here to persuade anybody. There's going to be no altar call, four verses, no card signed at the back, okay? I'm not trying to persuade. I'm trying to give information. I've got a colleague in biology, and when she goes to a church and they start asking about her, the minute she says, I'm a biology teacher, she knows exactly what the next question is going to be. And she dreads it. Because she said, the minute I say anything about that, I am going to be marginalized. And suddenly, I am not a worthy member of that congregation anymore. We're not doing a very good job ministering to Christians in science. As a matter of fact, we tell our kids not to go into science. It's the devil's playground. And so no wonder science is filled with non-Christians. oh, well, if you become a Christian, you've got to give up all of those scientific conclusions that you believe. And we end up adding to the gospel something that's not there. The age of the earth and human origins and name all your other issues are not, we can't encumber the gospel with those things. They don't determine whether you are in the kingdom or not. Young people leaving the church by the droves because they grew up being told that there's a war and that you've got a choice to make, and if you choose science, you've rejected the Bible. And then they go off to college, to university, and they are given an explanation that sounds pretty persuasive to them. But they've been told they have to choose and that it's a war. And so they say, well, I guess I'm not a Christian anymore. What claims is the Bible making? There was a Japanese soldier, he and his squadron were put on an island to defend in the Pacific in World War II. The Armistice Day came and the war ended. They tried to tell him, they dropped leaflets, they tried to send messengers in, and he didn't believe any of it. Didn't believe the leaflets, that's propaganda. Didn't believe the messengers, you've been bought. 1973, he finally came out and acknowledged that he had been wrong. See, he wouldn't believe the war was over. He may just find out that the war is over.
Dr. John Walton, thanks so much for being here with us today. How are you?
I'm very well. Glad to be here.
Great, thank you. I'm glad to have you here. Sorry, a little quick adjustment here. Well, we're glad to have you, ladies and gentle people. We have a great guest today, Dr. John Walton, as many of you will know from, we were talking about it earlier on Twitter, and thank you for being there and corresponding with me on that, and everybody with the kind words. So, Dr. Walton, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? Maybe start with your background and basically how you got interested in these topics, the ancient Near East, the Bible, the text, obviously, and then maybe we'll talk about your academic background a little bit.
Well, I was raised in a Christian home and very much immersed in the Bible from my earliest childhood and all through church growing up. And so I had an interest in Bible from the beginning, and my interest was Old Testament. I don't know why it ended up being Old Testament instead of New Testament, but there it is. And so that's how that went. So at first I was pursuing an accounting degree in college, basically because I didn't know what else to do. And I didn't see any particular career path in Old Testament. Just hadn't occurred to me that there are people out there who teach Old Testament. So that was kind of a fun discovery when I figured that out and said, oh, I'm going to do that. Forget accounting. And so I went on to do my graduate work in Old Testament. And then in my doctoral work, got involved in trying to understand the Old Testament against the ancient Near Eastern background. I was exposed to those ideas, and I thought that they were very persuasive. They suggested that there was a lot there to be mined that we hadn't really gotten into. Ancient Near Eastern studies was still fairly new because, of course, the tablets had just been excavated and translated and all of those things. So to that extent, that was sort of how I got into the field of Old Testament and ancient Near East.
In here. Okay, sorry. Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened. It looks like maybe one of our internets it might be mine. I'm not sure. Mine looks like it's good, but sorry about that. Could you please just start back maybe a few, like 30 seconds or so?
Okay, so I don't know, where did you hear last? Got into college, accounting, went
Mm-hmm.
into grad school, studying Old Testament, and then into my PhD program, focusing on the Old Testament and the ancient Near East. Basically, I was drawn to it because I saw that it was had a lot of potential for helping us to understand the Bible better. And it was a fairly new field at that point, relatively speaking.
Yeah, that's awesome. I seen that you were in accounting in 74, and then the next year you're studying Hebrew Bible.
Yeah, yeah. It was only in my junior year that I recognized that there was a career path teaching Old Testament. I just never thought of it. And so as soon as I knew that, I changed immediately. Took Hebrew and Greek my senior year in college, and then went on into Old Testament studies.
Very interesting. Thank you so much for being here, and I'm sorry about the issues, but today we are talking about The Lost World of Genesis 1, book by Dr. John Walton. It's been a pretty well received book, although there have been many people coming out with critiques, obviously. But why don't you tell us a little bit about the book and what was kind of like the persuasion to write the book? What is it about?
The persuasion to write it, if I'll start there, was that I came up with some ideas that I hadn't thought of before, that I didn't see anybody else coming to, that I thought were really important. And when that happens, you say, well, I guess I ought to put it out there and let people see it, consider it, critique it, and see how things go. You really can't write on a topic like Genesis 1 without drawing fire. And it's controversial stuff, and there are people that have very strong opinions about it. So I knew going into it that once I started writing on it, that was going to draw some critique, and that's okay. You know, I really don't mind if people disagree with me. I want them to represent me well. I want them to try to present evidence instead of sort of emotional rhetoric, but still, in the end, it's just important information to talk about. So I developed the thinking in the late 90s. And the basic idea of the book came to me while I was teaching a class in Genesis, up there lecturing, and suddenly the pieces just fell into place, and we had a very interesting discussion in the remainder of that class. But that was the beginning of it. The two basic premises were that maybe it's not in Genesis 1, maybe it's not the same kind of creation account that we would expect or look for from our culture. And that was the first part of it. And so then you start to say, well, what kind of creation account is it? What are the alternatives? If they would not have been inclined to think about the world in scientific terms like we do, how did they think about it? And the two things that I ended up with that showed a different way of thinking, or suggested a different way of thinking, was first of all that instead of a focus on the material world, they would have been more interested in what I first called the functional world, making it function. I found over the first couple of years that was a confusing idea to people. And there was a lot of misunderstanding of the word and what I meant by it. I'm more inclined these days to talk about the idea that they were really focused on order. They wanted to understand an ordered cosmos and an ordered society, and the two working hand in hand. And the whole idea of creation was ordering, to bring order so that it would function with a role and a purpose for everything. And so that's the way that I started to frame it. Then you have to ask, well, if it's being ordered for a particular purpose, what is that purpose? Now, of course, that's something that science can't talk about, what the purpose is. but it's something that clearly the Bible is interested in. And so when you ask about what God's purposes were for ordering the world, what was he ordering it for? The answer that I found in the biblical text was that he was ordering it to serve as a place of his presence. That his intention was to dwell among the people that he created, to be in relationship with us. That's a very important theological idea, and I think I can demonstrate its significance in the biblical text, and in fact, throughout the ancient Near East, how important those factors were, order and the presence of deity. And so that's the sort of the double basis that I started working on. The creation account was focused on order, and it was ordered to be a place where God would dwell with his people. That's why I called it sort of a temple paradigm, because of course the temple is where God dwells with his people and relationship happens. It's not that the cosmos itself is a temple, although I probably said that a few times in the early days. It's rather that the cosmos is sacred space, just like a temple is sacred space, because God is there and dwelling there with purpose and intention. So those are the two aspects, the idea of order, function, and purpose, and the idea of God's presence as he rests, not on a bed, but on a throne. God's rest is God's rule. And so that's something that, again, is very prominent in the ancient world, and you can find it in the Bible too. But we often didn't understand that in Genesis in the 7 days. We thought that rest was sort of a throwaway for the Sabbath or something, whereas really it's kind of the most important thing in the passage, that God takes up his seat on the throne, ruling this world that he has brought under his control and ordered it.
Yeah, I found that very interesting. A few things you said there. One is that you talk about the seventh day and the rest. I know I've heard you say before something like, listen, don't talk to me about the 6 days of creation. Yeah. As if the seventh day is a 7-day cycle, right? This is the part. I mean, this is included in the whole, this seventh day of rest. And I like some of the examples you give of like, because I moved recently. I remodeled a home and then sold it and then moved to another city. And so I love the example you give of like living out of boxes when you first move. It's like, where's my things at, whatever. So what you do is you're saying that during the 6 days, God is ordering as I would order my things in my room. I put these books here. Oh yeah, where's that book by Kurt McGregor? Oh, it's right here, right? And so that, and then you say that on the 7th day of the rest, that's when everything is there in order, and then he starts operating the knobs or whatever. He starts running the whole show.
Right. I mean, any CEO, a new CEO that takes over a company, is going to reorganize. He's going to order it according to his purposes, his vision, or her plans for the company, and those kinds of things. And that's that ordering process. And then once it's ordered, she can sit there at her desk and run the company.
That's a great analogy as well. So I guess well, I have a few things, but before we get to those, let's talk about you give an analogy of a house and a home, where you talk about your basic premise is that God isn't trying to teach us in Genesis 1 here how to build a house by the studs have to be here. This has to be at 13 degrees. You put a bracket on top, or it won't pass OSHA standards. He's not doing that. Instead, what you're saying that he's doing is he's teaching us about building a home and this idea of sacred space. Do you want to go into that at all before we move forward? Sure, go ahead.
Sure. The house represents the material structure, the foundation, the framing, the roof, the electricity, the air conditioning. It's the material structure. And that's an important first step, building the house. But of course, then once the house is all built, then it's just a structure sitting there. There's a whole nother step that goes into making it a home. And I propose that both of those are creation activities. Building a house is creation, and ordering it as your home with purpose, room by room, is also a creation activity. In the ancient world, I contend that it's the making of the home that was the more important one. And so certainly God is the house builder. If you think about the cosmos as this material structure, God is the house builder. But that doesn't mean that's the story that's going to be the most important one to tell for any given audience. We might think that's the most important story. Fine. We can't assume that it's Israel's most important story. And so I contend that really they're more interested in telling us the home story, how God took this house that he had built and was making it a home to work for us, to function as the place where he was going to live among us and be in relationship with us. So the question, is it a house story? Is it a home story? I've got another illustration if you'd like to hear it.
Feel free.
Not in any of the books, but I think that also indicates this. If you think about yourself going to a play, and you run into traffic problems and bad weather and construction and no parking, and you end up walking in a half hour late. And so you patiently wait till the intermission, and then you turn to the person next to you and you say, "How did the play begin?" And very helpfully, he says, "Well, it started when the play was written in the 1930s. You say, no, that's not what I want to know. He said, "Well, you can't have a play without a script." Yeah, I know, but he said, okay. This theater was built in the 1950s. No, you said, that's not what I want. He said, "Well, you couldn't have the play without the theater. You've got to start." No. The person on the other side of you now is getting interested and says, I know. The set was constructed for the purpose of this play. And you say, no, I mean, the set's important. You can't have the play without the set. But that's not what I want to know. And now the person behind you gets involved and says, "Well, I've got it. The cast was chosen." And you say, no. And finally say, "Please just tell me what happened since the curtain opened." Now, all of those, script, theater, stage, set, cast, all of those are right answers. They are all ways that you can talk about how the play began. And really, you can't have the play without them. So they're essential, but they weren't of interest. And so when Israel's answering the question, how did the world begin? We have to figure out what they're getting at. In our modern day, we might answer that question by talking about the set and the stage, the material aspects of the world around us that science informs us about. But Israel wouldn't be very interested in that. They're aware of a material world around them. They know that's essential. But for them, the act of creation is really focused on
This order.
Bringing that order.
Yeah, so that's a great point. You make a distinction, and maybe we'll talk about this first, between Genesis 1 verse 1 and verse 2. And let's get into that. But I think what you're saying with the play, and correct me if I misrepresent you at any point, but I think what you're saying is like in Genesis 1 verse 2, it says, "The earth was without form and void, and the darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the face of the waters." And you're like, wait, where did the deep come from? Where did the waters come from? Where did this void, what is this void that, it's kind of like when you get into a play and you're like, where did this all start at? Where did that person come from? Is that what you're saying?
Sure. So in the play, if you're just watching the play unfold, when the curtains open, the set's there. The furniture's there on the stage, and whatever scene they want, the set is there for that scene. And you could say, well, whoa, how did that set get there? And how did they make that? But that really would be distracting. That's not really what's going on with the play. You start watching it with where the play opens. And so in Genesis 1-2, the set is already in place. Some aspects of it, at least. Some are still to come. But part of the set is already there. The earth is there. The waters are there. So that's the case in Genesis 1:2. Now, Genesis 1:1, I interpret, as others do, as a literary introduction. That is, it's telling you what the chapter is going to be about. Nothing happens in verse 1. It's not like God created the heavens and the earth in verse 1. God created the heavens and the earth in the 7 days. And that's why when you get to the end of the account, after the seventh day, it then says, and so in 7 days, God created the heavens and the earth. Okay, so verse 1 is not any independent act of creation. It's a literary introduction saying, let me tell you the story I'm going to tell you. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Let me tell you how that happened.
It's kind of like the preamble to these suzerain vassal treaties, how they have like a preamble first, and then they start listing the things of the actual contract. Is that what you're kind of?
Yep, that's another example. And of course, even through Genesis, you have the various Toledot sections. This is the generation of, and this is the account of, using the same Toledot Hebrew word language all the way through. Each one, and in a literary introduction to what's coming, a transition between sections. So Genesis does that.
Yeah, that's interesting. It seems to me that I want to get a little bit more into this, but I just want to say that it seems to me that a lot of the critiques of your view seem to be a lot of the same ones you've already answered, and then they seem also to be kind of surface level reading. Another thing is that I find a lot of the people who disagree with your view saying that things like, well, listen, I'm a fundamentalist up front. Okay, so I'll just go ahead and tell you that. But then, I had a discussion with somebody about this the other night, and I said, well, I think Walton would probably call himself a fundamentalist, but by that, he's not going to mean the same thing that you mean by it. By that, I think what he's going to say is that he would say something like, you might be a Western fundamentalist or something, in that you might consider yourself something like a fundamentalist, by which you mean something like whatever the textual author was meaning to say in the text, I accept that message fundamentally, right? You get where I'm coming from?
I believe in the authority of the text. It's God's word, and we're accountable to it. And that makes me a pretty conservative person. And that's really what the traditional theology is all about, taking the text seriously and sticking by it and being under conviction and submitted to it.
Right. Because one of the problems that I see people making is when they see what you're talking about in Genesis 1 and verse 1 and 2, they're going to say something like, oh, so he's saying that God's just ordering pre-existing material, that God didn't make all the materials and all these things. And that's not what you're saying, because you believe God made everything.
If you've read a single thing I've written or heard me talk, I always am very clear about that we're talking about what the story is. It's a home story. It's what's happened since the curtains opened. But of course, God made everything in every way, materially and every other way. And if people don't hear that, they're just not listening very carefully.
So yeah, that's a great point. And really what we're talking about in the book, the first chapter is about ancient cosmology. And we're kind of discussing how the ancient reader would have seen these things. Because when they hear, when they say something like God created the moon, or, these things, they're not thinking these physical objects like we do, as in the moon that we think of, right? They're thinking of lights or lamps. Do you want to talk a little bit about lights and lamps, is how that relates to the temple and those type of things?
Well, I mean, that's what people in the ancient world thought that these heavenly bodies were. From every indication we have, they believed that the stars were engraved on the underside of the solid sky. They didn't look at them as individual material objects, certainly not suns that are billions of light years away. The moon to them is not a rock in space reflecting the light of the sun. They wouldn't have known that it wasn't its own light. And so they called them lights. Now, of course, that's different from the rest of the ancient Near East, which thought they were gods. And so the Israelites don't share that view. But yet, the Israelites are living in this ancient world. And even though they don't share those particular viewpoints about the gods, they do think about the world around them in very similar terms to what everyone else would have thought. A solid sky and sun, moon, and stars inside the solid sky, and all sorts of other things. So those are ways of thinking. You could call it their mindscape, the mindscape of how they thought about the world around them. It's very similar. Now, that doesn't mean they're borrowing, from other pieces of ancient literature. That's a very different concept.
Sure.
With the Lost World books, I talk about the cultural river. And the Israelites were in the same cultural river as the Babylonians and the Egyptians and the Assyrians. And there are places where they were standing against it, like on idols or something of that sort. But it's still their cultural river. And even if they're rejecting parts of it, their thinking is very much in tune with what's going on around them.
Right.
So we have to recognize that.
100%. I'm with you there. So let's talk about that a little bit, because what really made me think, whenever I'm first of all, I bought the audiobook. Okay. And I've had the audiobook for quite a while. And whenever I was originally talking to you about coming on for an interview, I was, re-listening to the audiobook, and I'm like, you know what? I need to have the actual book, because when I'm listening, I'm hearing all these references, and you're like, well, let's talk about, is it Bara, where you're talking about there's 50 references to it, and then you list them all and you have them in a table. And I'm like, okay, I got to get the book, because this is kind of like a reference material for your work. So instead of listening to it on Audible and then writing down all the places that you think this is taught, I'm like, just forget it. Let's get the book as well. So now I can listen and then remember, oh yeah, that's in chapter 14 or whatever. And then when I get home, I can highlight it or whatever, So one of the things that I thought about was, whenever I'm this house and home story, I thought about when I'm describing to my wife or, somebody, they ask something like, well, if I'm moderating a debate or something, they'll be like, how'd the debate go? What was it about? And let's say it was on something like Calvinism versus, Molinism or something. Then I'm like, oh, what was it about? Well, let me start with modal logic. Okay. And then she's like, no, just stop. That's not what I meant by what is it about. Right. So that's what I kind of see with this, with what you're talking about with the house and the home. And before we move on from that, is that kind of, am I understanding that correctly? It's more that they're not going to they weren't trying to say that these creative acts were an origin story, but rather about making things functional for use. And then we'll move on to the next point.
I've actually stopped using a description like Genesis 1 is an account of cosmic origins, because the minute we talk about cosmic origins, we think science. So I've begun talking about it as an account of cosmic identity. It's trying to tell you what the cosmos is, what it's designed to do and be. And that's an identity question, not a science question. The example you gave of trying to explain modal theology, everything we communicate to anybody about has underlying ideas that go without saying. Or if they don't go without saying, the person's going to be confused and we have to explain something. That's the nature of communication. We build on ideas. And we should understand that that's the nature of communication in the Bible as well. It builds on ideas that go without saying in their own cultural context. There are things that everybody in that Israelite audience knew, and so the author didn't have to say it. But they're not things that we know. And so we've got to try to make up that difference.
God is the way. So I have the way I like to put it when people are pointing to, the Old Testament law or something, and I like to talk about how Christ says that God gave you that law of divorce because of the hardness of your heart, for example, I like to use the example of Paul with the, but it's mentioned elsewhere as well, but like of the giving babes milk until they're able to have solid food, right? And it almost seems to me that that's a solid principle if you even think about what it means for God to communicate with people. He has to condescend to people and communicate to them in terms that they would understand. And basically, you're just saying that, hey, listen, why wouldn't God communicate to them in what they knew or what they thought was
it has to happen. When God communicated to them, he worked on the assumption of some basic understandings and principles. He didn't change all of that and throw it all away. So it's communicated in their language and in their culture. There's really no other way for it to work.
Okay, great. So let's move forward to your, you have a distinction where you talk about natural and supernatural. And people who follow me will know I always talk about a similar idea. And while your point is that they weren't seeing God acting in the world as supernatural. They thought everything was God's. At every moment, God did everything. All the creation was God sustaining the world. When an act happened, it's God's plan and purpose, all of these things, right? And so the way that I've always typically thought about this, and I don't know if maybe I got an idea from somebody at some point or it just like hit me. I feel like it just hit me one day when somebody said, show me the supernatural when I was debating. And I was just like, you want me to show you the supernatural in natural terms? And it just kind of hit me that I think God would use natural terms to create something, to do something in nature, right? And so talk about your this distinction that you make, and like kind of how does that change or alter the way we view the text?
Well, people in our world today, not necessarily Christians, although it's surprising how many Christians think this way too, have sort of a naturalistic worldview. That is, they expect that everything has a natural cause and effect, explanations, and things like that. And so in today's world, you have to prove to somebody, at least they think you do, prove to them that there's something beyond the natural, that there is a supernatural. And of course, lots of times people won't believe it no matter what you have to say. So naturalism is the default. It's the expected, and you have to prove something is something else. And that's what happens when we end up with doing apologetics in the Bible, and there's supernatural things, and we have to try to prove to somebody that no, the crossing of the Red Sea, the division of the Red Sea, that, whatever. Was it natural? Was it not? See, that's our discussion. So there's the default assumption that everything's natural. In the ancient world, it's exactly the opposite. There's a default understanding that everything is supernatural, that everything that is being done, God is doing it. And therefore, there's no point in trying to tell them, oh, no, that has natural consequences. I mean, they understood that when you put a seed in the ground, that it would eventually grow a plant. So it's not that they had no understanding of what we would call physical, natural, material cause and effect. But they still believed that God was involved in it, making the plants grow. So they didn't have any category that corresponds to what we call natural. It just wasn't in their worldview. That means that the word supernatural, meaning not natural, would have no meaning to them, because supernatural only has meaning in reference to natural, and they didn't have that concept. So when they talk about God's special works, they use terms like signs and wonders. Signs means that they are evidences that God is active. It says nothing about whether they're natural or supernatural. Okay, wonders are those things which people would say, well, I couldn't do that. But of course, that refers to most everything that they can't do. But there are particular things that show God's interest and activity that make that very obvious. But again, that's not in the category of natural or supernatural. different kinds of distinctions. They certainly understood ordinary and extraordinary, normal and abnormal. Yes, by all means, they got that. But the difference between those was not, is God active or isn't he? Is God active in something that really could never possibly happen if he wasn't doing it? Those criteria are not the ones that are being used in the ancient world. Again, my point being that if we're going to understand their texts, we need to understand them from their perspectives.
Right, great point. So, you talk about sacred space, and let's talk about this for a few minutes, because I find this sacred space talk really interesting. I had Egyptologist Dr. David Falk on, and his book that we discussed, we kind of just went through his book, and we discussed his view of the Ark. It's called the Ark of the Covenant, and
it's a great book.
You're familiar.
Very good book.
You know what? I just seen so many lines between your work and his work that just kind of like were so parallel, because of the talk of the temple and how important sacred space was, and then how their influence from the Near East played on their views. And I found it very, they resembled each other, very similar in a lot of ways. And you want to talk a little bit about how the sacred space idea plays into this in your book?
Sure. In my mind, there's not a more important concept in the Bible, theologically speaking, than the concept of God's presence. As we've already talked about, I see Genesis 1 establishing God's presence, preparing for God's presence. But then you go all the way through the Bible, and the idea that people lose access to God's presence in chapter 3, that they try to regain God's presence in the Tower of Babel when they try to get God to come down, because that story is all about God coming down, not them going up. That's what the tower's for. And that didn't work so well. But then God making a covenant with Abraham, and through that relationship, a covenant, he is going to come and dwell in the midst of Abraham's family. That's the tabernacle and the temple of God dwelling, his presence in relationship with his people. But then, of course, it doesn't stop there. You launch right into the New Testament, and we get the description in the Gospel of John about how he came and tabernacled. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And he's even named Emmanuel, God with us. It's not just a Christmas story. It is the Bible story, God with us. And then you get to Jesus going away and saying, I'm going to leave you, but I'm going to send the Comforter to be with you. And you get him at the ascension saying, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age. You get Pentecost, where the Spirit descends and enters into them so that God's presence is actually in them, in the Spirit. And so we become the temple where God dwells among his people, the church. And finally, of course, into new creation, where there's no temple there because God is going to be there among us. It's the Bible story. And so that idea of God's presence, it's no surprise that it starts that story right in Genesis 1, that's what the 7 days are setting up, the presence of God.
Great point. And I find that concept very interesting, because in the work of Falk, he says that, this Ark of the Covenant, it's like that a single room could just be an empty room, but you add the Ark and the cherubim and these other things, that make this space sacred space. And I hear some people saying things like, well, hold on, couldn't God, have them make sacred space some other way or something like that? But as you said, he is condescending to, or as you're implying, he's condescending to using their worldview, or you say in the book that they thought about the cosmos in the same way as anyone in the ancient world thought, and not at all like anyone thinks today. And God did not think it important to revise their thinking. And that's really a strong point, because you're saying that Heiser makes this point, and as well. So it's something like, instead of telling them that their DNA molecule had the number of the hairs in their head numbered inside of it, he says, the hairs in your head are numbered, that kind of thing. And so when somebody tries to say that, well, couldn't sacred space be done some other way or whatever, right? You're just going to go back to well, why would God try to revise their worldview and make them do it to our standards?
Over and over, he uses the way they think, and sometimes he tweaks it. And of course, even with the temple, with God's presence, he tweaked it, because the temple was not only the place of God's presence and the place where sacrifices were brought, but it was also the place for Babylonians or Egyptians or anybody else, the place where they met the needs of the god. And it's so interesting, that God does the whole setup, the temple and the furniture and the architecture and the sacrifices, but says, but wait, I don't have any needs. That's not what this is all about. So it's very intriguing how he works into the ways that people thought, but yet always makes sure that there's those distinctions that are drawn that are going to differentiate them from the people around.
Well, great point. Yeah. So you kind of next in the book, you kind of go into concordism a little bit and discuss how, because I got a feeling that just from reading your work and knowing some of your other works, which I hope to have you back on to kind of go through some of the other books in the series, like the Lost World of the Flood and Adam and Eve and these others. But I got a feeling that you probably get accused of concordism because of which you say the text implies, but you're not coming to this as a scientist or somebody that has just studied science and is reviewing this material. You're a textual analyst, so you're just looking at the text and seeing what it implies, what it's actually saying without your 2020 glasses on, and you're saying that it doesn't appear from the text that this is what they're actually trying to get at, while you agree that God created everything, and you even say that you were a young earth creationist for over 20 years of your life, or more than half your life, right? So why don't you talk about concordism a little bit, as well as some of your background views and how that's played a role in this book?
Concordism has been defined a couple different ways, so that's always you have to be careful with all of that. The way I talk about concordism is when people are taking modern science that we feel pretty comfortable with and reading that into the text as if the text is giving room for it or even really implying it. And so again, a classic example where the text says God spread out the heavens, to say, well, that refers to the expanding universe. Well, not to them it didn't. That's not what they meant by stretching out the heavens. Now in concordism, they say it's okay to do that. The Bible's big enough to handle it, and it can accommodate our modern science in that way by reading our modern science into the text. But of course, the minute we give ourselves that flexibility, we've done something to this concept of authority, because authority then is no longer connected to what the author intended. It's connected to something which you presume God intended. But of course, that's backfired on us a few times. In the early 20th century, everybody thought that steady state universe was kind of a given. And they were very happy to read that into the Bible. The earth does not move, it's set on its foundation, and steady state universe is the way they thought. Then Big Bang cosmology came in as you move along through the 20th century. And they said, oops, now they have to read Big Bang cosmology into the biblical text. And see, that's the problem. The science that we feel assured about, sometimes it changes, but the Bible's not changing. And again, if you start meddling those things into the biblical authority picture, you've got a problem with biblical authority. The idea that you have to read those into the text is problematic. I don't want to read anything into the text. Now, that's the other point you mentioned, because some people say that I'm reading the ancient Near East into the text. And no, I'm trying very hard not to do that. I'm using the ancient Near East and the materials that we have from the ancient Near East to try to understand the Bible's cultural environment better. That is, I want to find out those things which are in an Israelite's thinking. I don't want to push things in there that aren't there. We always want to be aware of the hazard of imposing something foreign on the text. Our science is far into the text, and that's why I don't agree with the concordist approach. The ancient Near Eastern cultural river is not far into the text. Although some of the ideas in that cultural river, some of the Babylonian gods, for instance, and all of those are not foreign to an Israelite, but they are rejected by an Israelite. And we need to recognize that as well.
Gotcha. So, yeah, so you guys were talking to Dr. John Walton about his book, The Lost World of Genesis, Chapter 1. And I see your questions in the side chat. I will get to them at the end. We're going to spend 15 or so minutes answering questions. Dr. Walton said he'd be fine with that. And so, Dr. Walton, one thing I want to ask you is about one more thing before that. I was thinking about this myself, how somebody looking 3,000 years in the future, looking back on us, right? And they see some text that says something like, to whom it may concern. And that's kind of like you might say an American type, or maybe like a Western phrase, to whom it may concern, which may sound strange in someone else's language, right? Or in the futures at some point. And looking back on that, we can see that throughout the Western world, that is a used phrase or something, a phrase like it. And I'm thinking that they could read that and try to say that, to whom it may concern, they can break down those words and try to have some type of like an etymological kind of fallacy where they are using that phrase to imply something is not, because they're not used to that term. The term's been out of use at this point for 3,000 years or whatever, right? But the rest of the known world uses it. So if we see in Canada it being used, and we see in Europe it is being used, and then we see it in we find a document in the United States, then we can see that this is what the text says. But it also has a bearing whether the people around them use it, right? Because in the same way, you mentioned Abraham's covenant, there is a relationship between the structure of like suzerain treaties and the covenant that Abraham used, is, for example. So, and I just wanted to ask you, because we see these, people will acknowledge, yeah, sure, Dr. Walton, I understand there are these similarities, right? But I'm worried about that type of approach, because it almost sounds like they're copying or using, somebody else's approach. But can we talk about the importance of polemic and the importance of cultures that have a shared memory, right? A shared culture, shared memory, but also what's the significance of using polemics in their text as well? Because I'm going to be making a series later on where I want to talk about polemics, and hopefully you can help us with some insight on that.
I think one of the helpful distinctions to make is that many people, when I start talking about ancient Near Eastern texts in the Bible, they think that I'm talking about a literary indebtedness, a borrowing, because lots of people do talk that way, but I don't. I'm not talking about literary indebtedness. I'm talking about cultural embeddedness. That is, ancient Israel had a culture. And it was a culture that looked a whole lot more like Babylonians or Egyptians than it looks like ours. And so they have this embeddedness, that they're embedded in that culture. Now, you and I are embedded in our American culture, 21st century. That doesn't mean we like everything that we find there. You couldn't possibly like everything because there's too many contradictory things. And so there are things that we would argue against and stand against, or at least not like very much. And there are other things that we're perfectly comfortable with. And that's part of our embeddedness in our culture. And so at times we might engage in polemics. That is, we might say, no, I think that idea is crazy. And that doesn't stand up at all, this movement or that school of thinking or whatever. And so we could engage in polemic. But in one sense, everything that we talk about is tacitly disagreeing with somebody else who talks about it in a different way. At that point, that doesn't mean I'm arguing with somebody or engaging in polemic against them. It just means I have a difference of opinion. And I may just be speaking what I think is a presentation of what I think is true. And that wouldn't mean I'm arguing. So sometimes we argue, we debate, we critique, but other times we're just talking about what we think has value and what we believe. And it's the same thing in the Bible. Certainly there are times when the biblical authors are engaging in polemic. You look at Isaiah 10 or those passages where they say, you cut up this wood and you make an image out of half of it, and you worship it, and then the other half you burn in the fire. This is kind of, excuse me, stupid. And so there's polemic going on. But there are other times when the Bible is just making a point about what they believe to be true. And I'm not inclined to paint those as polemic. We can go back to Genesis 1, where we talked about the Bible calling the sun, moon, and stars lights. It's not uncommon for interpreters to say, oh, they didn't use the names sun, moon, and stars because they could be, sun and moon could be names of gods. Well, it's true. They could be names of gods, but the Israelite writers don't have any hesitation to using those words in other places. So I'm not inclined to think that in Genesis 1, that's a polemic. I think it's rather they're talking about the functions. These things are lights. That's what they do. And I don't see that they're making an argument against a Babylonian worldview, for example. So I'm pretty careful about what I would label polemics. I'll call it polemics if I can tell in the context that they really are trying to argue against another position, instead of just letting it be tacitly floating around in the background.
Right, like the Rider on the Clouds motif, for example. That may be an example from
right. I mean, that's something that's in the cultural background, and that they can pick that up, which is sometimes used for Baal, and use it for Yahweh, no problemo.
Yeah, because they're not using it in the same way. Right? They're saying like, no, not Baal. Yahweh is the one that rides in the clouds, kind of thing.
Or they're just using the motif. I mean, maybe they are, depending on the rest of the context. Maybe they are arguing against a Baal theology, but maybe they're just using that motif to describe Yahweh because it's appropriate.
Sure. Okay. It's fitting. Yeah. We have a one thing that I learned that I didn't know this, and I'm not sure how I didn't know it. I mean, but you point out that the Israelites thought of the entrails, the intestines, the heart, all of the entrails of the body as functioning like a brain or like a mind. And so you pointed out that the word for mind is really the word for entrails, and that your translators are just helping you out, kind of. And so you talk about how they didn't think of the brain as something that was the process center of thoughts and your mind and these types of things. You even give an example from ancient Egypt where they would preserve the entrails and then just toss the brain, basically.
Right.
That's another example. And I just got to say that I found it interesting that because of I was relying on a translation, right? I mean, I have an interlinear now for the past couple of years, but I was relying on translation to the point where I can take the term mind, which means entrails, and think about it. We still use something like that today where we say, go with what your heart says or something, right? But yeah, I just found that such a great point. And then the difference between, but also the point about the translation, because somebody said, like, one of the criticisms I heard of your view is that, oh, so what about the person in the pew, like the average person? Do they need to know all about the ancient Near East, and they can't study all this stuff, right? And so they're saying, like, we use our Bible. We don't use what we know about the ancient Near East. And that's just another good example that, no, you're dependent on a translator first, right? And so do you want to say anything about that?
Sure, they can use their English Bible because somebody else did the work and learned the language and translated it for them. And so that's fine. That's how things work, that people use their expertise to benefit other people. And so, yes, people in the pew need somebody else to help them. That's how they have an English Bible in their hands. And that's true of culture as well. There are places where you need someone who's acquainted with culture, just like you need someone who's acquainted with language, so that they can fill you in on something that you didn't know. I mentioned earlier that the Tower of Babel is all about God coming down, not people going up. That's not something you'd automatically know on your own. You'd need someone to explain the culture. And that's no embarrassment. We are not all autonomous at every point. That goes exactly contrary to what Paul says about the body of Christ, that we all depend on one another. And so we all count on the rest of the body to help us function as the body of Christ. And that includes, even academics have a role to play. Surprise. That doesn't make them any better than people who work in the nursery, or people who sweep the floors, or people who preach the sermons, or people who sing in the choir. It's things that we all do to contribute to the body of Christ. Get over it. It's the church.
Yeah, but didn't you know, Dr. Walton, that that God uses the small things of the world to confound the wise, right?
Absolutely.
So that just sounds like a bunch of scholarship. I'm just kidding. Let's talk about a few of the critiques that you've had, and then we're going to go to Q&A here in about maybe 5 or 10 minutes. But one thing is, before we get into that, because I've heard this critique before, but I think you actually changed your view before you got critiqued on Rakia, right? In the book, you talk about it as the solid dome, but you actually have changed your view since the book, saying that you think expanse is a better word because you think there's a better word for the solid dome. Why don't you talk about that just for a few minutes?
Sure. It was when I was doing my commentary on Job that I came across a word that was a fairly rare word. And when I studied it, I said, that looks like it's really describing the solid dome of the sky. But if that word describes the solid dome of the sky, then Rakia does not. And so then I went back and rethought Rakia and thought through it all, and finally concluded that Rakia referred to the empty space between the solid sky and the earth. And that it's kind of like the bubble, with waters all around. And so the Rakia is that space. It's controversial, and maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong, doesn't really matter. But God made it, whatever it is. So sometimes new information or new research might lead us to change our minds. And I think that's healthy and perfectly fine. So yes,
100%.
I did change my mind on Rakia.
Yeah, I mean, it just shows that you're open for change, for critique. Yeah, that's actually really helpful. And so I have heard a few people say things like we can't rely on the ancient Near East because what we're going to do is we're going to use it to read into the text. And we already kind of touched on this a little bit, but do you think there's any type of danger? Because as you've said, like, all I'm going to do is look at the text. That's my foundation for what I want to find out is what is this trying to indicate. But do you think that some people that say there's a danger in trying to look at other cultures because Israel was set apart? That's their whole thing, is that they were set apart. And, do you think there's a danger in looking at these other sources and comparing them where maybe you could have a misjudgment? Or do you pretty much say, like, hey, look, I can look at this for myself and find out whether I think the text isn't trying to say it?
Any tool can be dangerous if you misuse it. That doesn't mean it can't be helpful. If we said, well, I can't use a hammer, I might hit my thumb, so I'm not going to use a hammer. I'll try to use my fist to pound that nail in. That would be stupid. You use what tool will work, but you use it carefully. And any tool can be abused or misused. And that's true with ancient Near East as well. So the trick is, what are you doing with it? To say that Israel was set apart, of course they were. They were set apart as God's chosen people. But that doesn't make them a cultural vacuum. I want to use the ancient Near Eastern material to do what it can do. If you're not going to assume an ancient Near Eastern background, what background are you going to assume? If you're going to assume a modern one, what's your rationale for that? If you assume a modern backdrop, as if their culture was all the same as ours, then you're also running the danger of imposing something on the text that's foreign to it. We want to penetrate what they thought as they wrote these biblical books, what they would have been understanding, what their audience would have been understanding.
Right.
Because that's how God has set up the authority that he has vested in them. So I'm going to use every tool at my disposal. And that includes the ancient Near East, because Israel, for all its distinctiveness, hear me carefully, for all its distinctiveness, it is still in the ancient Near Eastern world. They thought about family, they thought about cities, they thought about architecture, they thought about city planning, they thought about all of these things in the same way that people thought in the ancient world. And so we need to recognize the distinctives. But anybody who does comparative studies between the Old Testament and the ancient Near East knows that the most basic rule of thumb is that you need to look at both similarities and differences.
Great point. All right, so maybe one more critique of your view, and then we'll go to Q&A. So if you have any questions that haven't been asked yet, go ahead and ask them now, so that when we go to Q&A, that will be I'll be able to ask that. I actually think I have a clip here. Let me see if this will play. It's about 30 seconds, and you can respond to it.
The question is whether Genesis 1 describes God as bringing into being the things that are described, whether he uses material or not, or does he merely specify the functions for things that are already in existence? I think that we have to guard here against erecting false dichotomies. Just because a text speaks of God specifying an object's function doesn't exclude efficient causation as well. Walton has to show that the text of Genesis 1 is concerned exclusively with functional creation. It is not enough to show that functional creation is involved. He has to show that efficient causation does not come into the picture at all.
All right. Walton, that was William Lane Craig. Obviously, he speaks of you very highly. He said that, that you're a super bright person, that you're a prolific author. He obviously spoke about you very highly. He said that he had correspondence with you, so he obviously understands that you're a scholar of top rank, right? But he has this is one of the critiques that he has, and I just wondered, did you want to respond to that and kind of tell us what do you see wrong with that critique?
Well, one of the most common critiques, Dr. Craig didn't make this up. One of the most common critiques is people who say, why can't it be both? It's all well and good to talk about how order and function and role and purpose are significant in the biblical text, but why can't it be material too? And that's basically the nature of his question. I don't have to prove that it is only function, and order. It's not like the burden of proof is on me. I had to prove that there was function and order involved. Now, he sounds like he's assuming that material must be involved. You can't assume that. Prove it to me. Show that material is involved. And so I go through day one, nothing material. It's time, light. Those are not material. Day two, space. Nothing material. Day three, it says, let the plants grow. Let the dry land emerge. It doesn't say he made them. Nothing material. Day four, he made the sun, moon, and stars, or he did the sun, moon, and stars. Okay. Those sound material, but of course they're not to the Israelites. And therefore, an Israelite wouldn't read day four and say, oh, here God is making material objects. Well, no, they don't think they're material objects. They think they're lights. Day five, let fish swarm, let birds team. When day after day after day after day, it doesn't talk about the material, that leads me as a hopefully sensitive reader to say that wasn't very interesting to them. But again, I have to emphasize that doesn't mean that God did not create the material world. Of course he did. And when he created the material world, our theology tells us he created it out of nothing, because there's no material that was not created by God. So I absolutely believe in creation out of nothing, but I don't think Genesis 1 is talking about creation out of nothing, because creation out of nothing is a material category. And if it's not talking in material categories, then that is not its interest. And so in that sense, I feel like there's a burden of proof that they need to pick up to say, why do you think that it is material? And they're trying to say, I have the burden of proof to prove that it's not material. And you heard what my proof is.
Yeah, great point. So yeah, I really like both of you guys, of course, and I'm sure you guys like each other. Obviously, I'm sure you've appreciated some of the work of Craig as well. I've actually talked to Craig's people. I may end up having him on the show. They said perhaps, so we'll see. But I would love to hear a discussion between you two in the future at some point. Maybe that would be fruitful for the edification.
Well, he mentions that we've communicated, and we have, and I've told him these things. And I've told him about places where he's misunderstood or even misrepresented me. And he hasn't changed anything. So that makes me feel like he's not really much interested in productive thinking. And I'm just not interested in arguing with people.
I understand. Well, thank you so much for answering those questions. We're going to go to Q&A. I'm going to get all the questions in order here. That way I can just ask them straight out and you can answer, and then we can move forward. Why don't you talk about, while I'm getting these in order, what you mentioned about the term for make and how God did the heavens and the earth, that kind of thing. Exodus 20 was one of the examples, right? Why don't we talk about that while I'm getting these in order?
Well, yeah, you saw in the clip that led off this sequence that the verb asa in Hebrew is translated do or make, but it's also translated dozens of other ways in normal English translations. It's a very multi-purpose kind of word. And so, God was, he says you shouldn't do your work, and because the Lord didn't do his work. And so you ask, what is the work that he is doing? So when you get to Genesis day 4 and you say, God asa the sun and moon, well, he's doing them. What is he doing with them, to them, for them? Right? And I would say he's giving them their role and purpose in the ordered system. That is asa. That is his doing. Now, we're the ones that tend to turn it into a manufacturing material kind of activity. And so in that sense, What is God's doing? You read it in Genesis 2, verses 3 and 4. Okay, that he finished his doing in his baraing, his creating. And again, that means you have to figure out what it means when it talks about God creating. And that's where I tie into giving order and purpose.
All right, thanks so much for that. Sorry, I keep having to mute my mic because there's so much wind outside. It's just like blowing by this window over here and just like howling. But so our first question will be from Praise I Am. Some of these are a little bit off topic. Is that fine? I mean,
Well, depends if it's off topic, then I have to do a lot of background to try to answer it, perhaps. So we
had two questions that were about one from a guy named Praise I Am That I Am, and another from Computer Theist. And basically they said, and I've already kind of heard your view on this, they said, Converse, what does Dr. Walton think of slavery in the Old Testament? Is it the same as antebellum slavery? And I've heard you kind of address this before, but yeah.
No, it's not at all the same as antebellum slavery. And so we have to take that into account. That's, again, part of a cultural aspect. But more important, I mean, it is important to define what kind of slavery we're talking about. Debt slavery is a lot different from antebellum slavery. But at any rate, you still have to talk about issues like what is Torah? Lots of people read Torah, they call it the law. I don't think that's a particularly good translation, but they read about the Torah and they think that this is God laying down an ideal system. And that makes them concerned because is slavery part of an ideal system? And they think, no, it shouldn't be. And so you get all of those questions. And my point would be, no, God is not laying down an ideal system. Now, to get all of my explanation of why he's not and what he's doing, there you can look in my Lost World of the Torah book and develop that over a whole book's length.
Right. Yeah. So I was actually so surprised about how many books you've actually written or edited, like an immense amount. I would say what is probably over 30.
It's somewhere around 30. Yeah.
I mean, I started looking because you're going to make a lot of money off me buying books. I can tell you that because you've just got so many out there that I'm interested in. I read one title, I'm like, he wrote on this subject. Are you serious? So now I got to get that. So anyway, even I have a baby on the way, is being born next month. And correct me if I'm wrong here, but I found a baby Bible stories book or something that you helped publish or whatever.
Yep. Tiny Todd's Bible story book.
I was looking through your books and my wife had asked me, she's like, I wonder if there's a good book on like for babies, like Bible stories. And I was like, I just seen one. So anyway, we have another question. Says, has John Walton heard of the Ivri in Exodus 21, 2-4 as Habirus from Egypt and Canaan? And does he support it?
The Habiru question has been a long, contentious question. Certainly they come from the same basic Semitic root, but that doesn't prove a whole lot. I think that a fairly persuasive case has been made that you can't look at every occurrence of Habiru in the Amarna text, for instance, and say that that's the Israelites. You could go the other way and say, among all the many different people who could be called Habiru, are the Israelites one of them? And I think that's possible, that Israelites doing certain things might be categorized as Habiru, but Habiru does not equal Hebrew.
Right, yeah. So David Falk did a video on this, and basically he says what you just said. Like very, very similar on that.
That's become pretty standard.
Sure. So here is another question from Jamie Russell. Says, do you see the church or the physical body is the temple rather than a building?
I think Paul gives us that idea, and the idea that God dwells in us, his corporate people today, makes that a very defensible position. So I tend to think of church technically as referring to God's people. Like everybody else, I still talk about, oh, let's go to church and we have to clean the church today and things like that. And yeah, multiple use.
All right, thanks so much. That's another point you make, and that is that words are going to be defined based on usage, because
Right.
you say they didn't leave us a dictionary. They left us a lot of stuff, but they didn't leave us a dictionary. So we have to look at usages of the term to find out what they meant by the term, and that's a great point. Got another one here from Jamie Russell. Does Dr. Walton think the Old Testament writers had a form of dualism or physicalism regarding the nature of man and or death?
I certainly would not immediately assume that they thought in terms similar to us of a physical body and a immaterial soul and things of that sort. But it is a very complicated discussion. They have their own terminology, nefesh, basar, ruach, that we tend to translate as things like body, soul, and spirit. But again, translation is going to be limited to the words you have in English to convey these ideas. So all of those reflect very complicated issues. And I'm, again, number one, I'm not a philosopher, theologian type who sorts out all of those theological anthropology kinds of issues.
Sure.
But I'm very careful not to impose on that language our more modern ideas or even Aristotelian or Platonic ideas.
Okay, great point. So here's a question that's actually pretty relevant to the topic. And feel free to just say pass if it's something you don't want to get into. I mean, honestly, just do that. But here's a really good question pertinent to the topic. Who specifically does he think the authors of the texts are? We talk a lot about the documentary hypothesis and Moses writing the Torah and these types of things. What are you thinking on this? What is your take?
So I have a Lost World book called Lost World of Scripture. And there one of the points I make is that in the ancient world, there's nothing at all like books as we know them, and there's nothing at all like authors as we know them. And yet, here we, in our modern approaches, first question we ask, who's the author of the book? Well, they didn't have authors and they didn't have books. And they were in a hearing-dominant culture, not a text-dominant culture, which means that the first impulse is not to write something down. Their first impulse in communication is to say it. So, of course, the prophets spoke. Thus says the Lord. And so it's a hearing-dominant culture. Writing was done in a limited way, and this is not the question of literacy. It's just how much writing did they do and when did they do it? And writing was done in very specific kinds of contexts for very specific kinds of readings and purposes. And whatever was written down would have been stored in places that were not circulating libraries. And therefore, people, even if they could read, and most probably could not to any extent, they wouldn't be able to get to them. So typically, my conclusion out of all of that is that what we call books, that is the books that we have in our Bible, arriving at that book status was the last step, not the first step. We shouldn't think that, oh, somebody wrote down and wrote a book and we call it Numbers. No, that's not a model that works in the ancient world.
Okay, thank you so much for that. We'll move on to our next question, which is from eReview. Says, when does Dr. Walton believe the Exodus took place?
In time and space. I wish I knew, but our information is limited and mixed. I do believe there actually was an Exodus, which of course not everybody does, but there's still not sufficient information from either archaeology or inscriptions or biblical text to nail down a date. So I'm very happily, patiently waiting for more data.
Sure. Okay. Thanks so much for that. Our next question, and we only have maybe a couple more, is, let's see, well, that's more of a comment there. Let's see, question here. Okay, so we already answered that one. Yeah. If Genesis 1:1 is not a material creation, doesn't this make God as some sort of Zeus who just pops out of nowhere to bring things into order?
God doesn't pop. Okay, that's not what he's doing. Okay, remember, this is the Israelites telling the story that resonates with them. It's inspired, so it's not like, there's no God involvement, but God works through them to tell the story that makes sense in their world. Okay, so the order that we experience, that Israelites experienced in the world, they're saying God is the one who did that ordering, and he did it with the purpose of dwelling among us. See, you tell a narrative because you want to give some meaning to something. What meaning do you find in creation? And the Babylonians found one kind of meaning in creation in the way they told the story, and they talked about order as well, but they found different meaning in that, and Egyptians found other meaning. And so the question is, what meaning are the Israelites finding in God's creating, which is, again, for everybody in the ancient world, his ordering of the world? What meaning are they finding in it? And that's where you find the distinctive view of the God of the Bible. So no, he's not just popping in, he's doing everything. Remember, God created everything in every way. And that's the, if you think in terms of a line of primates or a pool of amino acids, or you think in terms of something more immediate of God doing something, you think in terms of God making each one of us. God has made everything in every way. He doesn't pop. He's there always doing his work.
Right. And yeah, so that's such an important point to end on, because I've heard you in your lecture series say something like, listen, I'm not trying to persuade you. I actually don't care which side you take. I don't, I'm not going to argue against one side or the other as far as science or something like that goes. All I'm going to say is that I agree with you that God created everything and that God ordered everything and all of these things. But all I'm saying is that what the author of the text is trying to intend is that in Genesis, he's ordering these things for use and to dwell among us. Mm-hmm. So you agree with the fact that God created the world, God ordered the world, everything was brought about by him and all these things. It's just that you want to say that the author is not intending what a lot of people want them to be intending.
Sure. I mean, going back to how did the play begin? Right. All of those were accurate ways to talk about it. But I want to know what they are focusing on, what they intend to talk about. Again, it's not a matter of what kinds of things did God create. He created everything. The question is, what story are they telling? And that's what we have to try to focus on.
All right. Thank you so much for that. I hope you had a good time here. I definitely enjoyed this. You're one of my favorite authors, scholars that I both listen to and read. I'm going to definitely want to have you back on to talk about some of your other books, if you're up for that in the future.
We can talk about it. I do a lot of podcasts. So
awesome. Thank you so much. And I will be having on Dr. Kurt McGregor here I think it's next Friday. Then we'll have on Dr. Liz Jackson and then Dr. Michael Heiser in June. So that's going to be really fun. If you guys want to check that out, please hit the notification bell or subscribe if you haven't already. And hopefully we'll be talking to Dr. John Walton in the future more. So thanks everyone for checking this out. And thanks, Dr. John Walton, for spending your time with us. I actually think it's very charitable for scholars to take the time that they have and spend it with people here online. So thanks so much for that.
Been fun talking, William.
You too.